Your freedom of speech is under attack like never before. Never did we think, in the democratic Western world, the US, Canada, the UK and Australia, that we would be living under authoritarian rule. It may not be overt in the form of government control like North Korea or Russia, but make no mistake, you and I are subjects of an elite web of organizations made up of governments, social media giants, fact-checkers, and universities who are moderating and in some cases censoring every word we say to push their own agenda. But how do they get away with it? Well, carefully selected fact-checkers label any opinion that goes against the official narrative as misinformation, which gives them a free pass to block the content from being seen and shared. Sky News Australia digital editor Jack Houghton investigates, speaking exclusively to Twitter Files co-founder Michael Shellenberger to expose the tactics this web of elites use to censor what you say. Social media giants like Meta, X, formerly Twitter, and TikTok command the eyeballs of over 4 billion people. Their sheer reach means they have unrivaled power to influence the narrative like never before. But with power comes responsibility. Responsibility to moderate the opinions and content of those billions of users. But what happens when the moderation only goes one way? Where is the line between opinion and misinformation? And indeed, what happens when they get it wrong? Esteemed author Michael Shellenberger comments.
Two questions there. I mean, what started to happen is that with growing intolerance of other people's views, you see particular political activists labeling disagreements misinformation. Opinions about whether that's a good piece of legislation, where fair-minded people can have a different point of view, people will label that misinformation. So it's a real abuse of that term in particular. But I also think that, look, free speech, whether in the United States or in Australia, or whether it's what's in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, it says that we're not actually going to only protect free speech for things that we agree with or with things that we consider to be accurate. Free speech is everybody's right. There's only a very small number of cases where governments in free societies restrict what people are able to say. It's fraud, incitement to violence, child exploitation. Those are very limited things, but really much more broadly. And by the way, the incitement to violence has to be immediate. It can't be vague, prejudicial or racist statements. Those are all things that society must allow. In fact, we have an instrumental reason for that. We think it's better for people to overcome their prejudices and hatred by being able to talk about them. If people have bad ideas, we think it's better to talk about those ideas rather than to censor and repress them for it.
The idea that fact-checkers are trusted and paid big sums of money by social media giants and government organizations to be the arbiters of truth flies in the face of the First Amendment, which by law prevents the government from making laws that prevent freedom of speech.
But we also think that it's a fundamental human right to be able to share your views and to have access to information, whether it's accurate or inaccurate. This is what it means to live in a free society. This debate was had, I should point out, really 300 years ago in Europe. We decided that the public really wanted free speech. We did not want the government deciding what was true or false, because obviously politicians have a big incentive to lie and to censor their political opponents. And so I do think that we need to remind people that these freedoms that we've taken for granted are really under threat. And those include the right to disagree, to be disagreeable, and even to offend people. That's absolutely a protected right, and one that we should demand be protected.
The Twitter Files was a groundbreaking investigation which revealed a joint effort by social media companies and the US government to censor conservative views on a range of issues in the US and abroad.
You have done a lot of work that's led global conversations around what you've dubbed the censorship industrial complex. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why this work is important to you?
Well, sure. I mean, my interest in censorship really began when I was one of the Twitter Files authors. We were given access to internal emails and messages within Twitter. And what we discovered was, at first, the kind of censorship that you would expect, very politically correct, very sort of radical left censorship. But then we started to discover something very strange, which is we started to see requests from the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, other sort of security and intelligence agencies asking for people to be censored. We found that very chilling and very strange, and that really was the beginning of starting to understand that there was a vast apparatus of government agencies around the world, not just in the United States, think tanks, some of them associated with universities, and other groups that were putting pressure on social media platforms to engage in outright censorship of people for just having different views, whether on COVID vaccines or on climate change or on various racial matters, sensitive issues that should be publicly debated, that our Constitution protects as free speech. Really clear violations of the First Amendment, and we was shocking to see that the government was funding these organizations to the tune of tens of millions and maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's why we labeled it the Censorship Industrial Complex, because it's quite big, quite powerful, and really until recently was hidden from the public.
The Twitter Files revealed that government organizations such as the FBI worked closely with social media giants Meta and Twitter to censor a New York Post article that aired allegations regarding the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop. The article was labeled as misinformation as links to share it were blocked.
I agree. I think the Hunter Biden laptop story really is so emblematic of all the problems that we have with the press over the last few years, that started maybe with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, shocked the media system because they didn't know anyone who would possibly vote for Donald Trump. But it continued more into what we've seen since then, which I think the Hunter Biden laptop story showed us, which was this kind of anti-speech activism in the press. We saw it with COVID. We saw it with the laptop. This idea that this sort of information is too toxic to even get into. It's potential misinformation or disinformation, so we need to keep it from the public's eyes. And we saw that in the way that the tech platforms worked with the intel agencies here in America to have this sort of collusion to suppress and silence it. But then the media joined in as well, because they refused to call out these tech platforms that censored the New York Post, that made it so you can't share this link. And I believe it really was the beginning of this new era of an even more dangerous form of suppression and media malpractice.
The Twitter Files were also instrumental in exposing the censorship of information and opinions regarding the origins of COVID-19, says Sky News All-Star Douglas Murray.
Now, finally, I've got to ask you about this. The UK, we're hearing more reports of social media outlets colluding with government agencies to suppress free speech. The British government had a secret unit called the Counter Disinformation Unit, very Orwellian sounding there, and it worked with social media companies, Douglas, to censor speech that was critical of lockdowns and mandates and mask restrictions, all that madness. This was happening not just in the US, as we've found out through the Twitter Files, but in Australia, in the UK, and I would hazard to guess elsewhere.
Yes, and I think the thing about this story, Rita, is it just chimes in with something that so many of us sort of vaguely intuited at the time. There was something so strange about the way in which, governments around the world all would say the same thing in lockstep. The portions of the media are all expected to say the same thing. And I think that there was just, some of us sort of whiffed at the time, there was something off about this. And now we know one of the reasons why there was something off about it, which is that there was a concerted effort at a government level, colluding with others, including in social media, to basically dampen down voices that were skeptical of government policy. I think it's quite extraordinary. I think there's a lot more to come in this, because remember, the voices that they were dampening down and getting off social media included, scientists from Oxford University, people like Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford. There were sort of serious figures. And I think this is, in a way, the most worrying thing. It's very worrying when any member of the public is effectively sort of muted or silenced by government diktat. But the fact that they could do it with respected figures whose voices we could have done with hearing more, that's something really worrying. And as you say, there is something very Orwellian about this, about government and secretive units deciding not just what the public can say, but what we can hear. I hope that in the endless rolling COVID inquiries to come, there's going to be a real look at exactly what happened at that level and when.
But what happens when the fact checkers are wrong? For one, investigative journalism is compromised, as experienced by Sky News Australia journalist Shari Markson.
Now, fact checkers deemed it false to suggest that the virus could have escaped a lab. And now we know that that's a very real scenario, and it's widely accepted as a possible cause of the pandemic. Here is our journalist Shari Markson explaining the impact that those fact checks had on her reporting.
Millions of dollars in fines if the tech giants don't take down disinformation and misinformation. New draft legislation by the Albanese government. Now, we battled with the tech giants and other media outlets to get out our reporting on Wuhan, to keep going even though we were being bullied.
If your reporting doesn't exactly match up with the orthodoxy view on that subject, you risk being labelled a spreader of misinformation, just like Shari Markson was. And this is just one story which should anger you.
Fact checkers are, at the end of the day, only human, and humans are prone to bias. Facebook was forced to come out and admit that their fact checks are just opinion.
The New York Post editorial board wrote this back in 2021, explaining how the big money fact-checking ecosystem was defending lawsuits after publishing false fact checks. Facebook finally admitted the truth. The fact checks that social media use to police what Americans read and watch are just opinion. That's thanks to a lawsuit brought by celebrated journalist John Stossel, which has exposed the left's supposed battle against misinformation as a farce.
So, who's policing the police? Who is certifying the fact checkers? It's the notoriously secretive International Fact-Checking Network, IFCN, which Jack Houghton says is incompetent.
A growing number of fact-checking projects around the world are analysing claims of public figures to determine
when it came to exposing the issues with the IFCN, they stopped responding to Sky News Australia emails after we started asking about glaring issues in its processes. This includes pointing out that 53 fact-checkers across the world have expired credentials, and our understanding is that this body, which has received millions of dollars to certify fact-checkers, is being delayed by pure incompetency. And while we could not get an interview with IFCN Director Angie Holland, this clip from her time as a fact-checker at Politico in America is very telling.
It gets really a little bit mental when people say why we're wrong if they're not dealing with the evidence. And my response as editor is well, you can say that we're biased, but all you want, but tell me where the fact check is wrong.
With critical mistakes made and deficiencies exposed, there are calls for increased scrutiny of fact checkers, says Australian Senator Alex Antic.
The ability for experts to dictate terms over what happens in our society now has reached critical mass, and there has to be some inquiries, and they have to be fleshed out into the public domain. And we need media organisations to start reporting the entire facts, not just the facts that suit their political narrative, but the facts as journalists used to. And this is why the independent journalist space has become so important, and I think is under threat from this terrible Labor ACMA bill.
But there is some hope. The monopoly of the social media giants is being challenged with the rise of alternative platforms. Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter has resulted in a major loosening of censorship, which was rife within the company since its inception. Plus, other platforms like Rumble, Donald Trump's Truth Social, and Spotify uphold the freedom of speech of their creators. Former Fox News host Tucker Carlson sees this as a major win against censorship.
Twitter matters, whether you want it to or not. Twitter is hardly the largest social media platform, but Twitter sets the tone for all news coverage, for all information. Twitter is where our professional class goes to learn which opinions are acceptable and which are forbidden. And the effect is obvious to everybody. If our public conversation suddenly seems stilted and one-sided, it is because, in part, Twitter itself is so stilted and so one-sided. Anyone who dares express a heterodox opinion, even if it's true, gets banned. We found that out last week the hard way. So whatever you think or think you think of Elon Musk, he certainly understands that. Twitter's shares surged nearly 30% on the news of Elon Musk's purchase. So for him, it turned out to be a pretty good buy. But it's hard to imagine that Musk bought Twitter shares for the investment. He's already the world's richest man. He does not need the money. Could this be the first move in a hostile takeover of Twitter that transforms Twitter into a platform for free speech?